Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for joining us today for the American Advertising Federation of Birmingham chapter. We are really excited to have you here today and kind of start the year off with a bang with a wonderful speaker we have lined up for you. I'm really excited about it. But first of all, I do want to just go over a few little things that we have in the works. And one big thing we have in the works. First of all, we our board has been really busy behind the scenes during COVID. I know that we haven't been able to see people in person, but we are definitely on task getting things done for our advertising community to help support you and also to help just elevate the people, what we do, the creative, because it is so important to Birmingham and has been for years, and we want it to continue to be that way. Um, just for a quick rundown, you will be seeing a new logo and branding for AAF Birmingham. National has created that, and we are busy implementing it into all of our websites and everything where you see our logo. And the tagline, the unifying voice of advertising is what will be used. But be looking for that to come out soon. Also, we are working on some community service. Our board member, Rashida Reish, who is with Rebirth Marketing, she's the owner of that. She is working on some community service coming up soon. And if you are interested in joining us for that, we will welcome you to do that. I would love to have you with us. Also, okay, we're going to go to the big one now. The American Advertising Awards are coming up and we are on it. We're excited. This year, it is going to be virtual. Everything's virtual. Judging is virtual and the event is virtual, which has been the trend across the country. So everybody is acclimating to that. Well, not everybody, but most people are, and I think they're glad they are with the continued uncertainty of social distancing and everything that goes along with it. But we're just set to have a good time and to see some great creative work. Just as a reminder, our entries are due this Friday by midnight. Go to Birmingham or bhamaddies.com. You can do your entries there. It's all digital. You will have no physical entries that you have to do. It's easier than ever. There's no drop-off point. You have to go meet and drop everything off. It will be all virtual, and they're allowing some additional things that you can do, like with more photographs and such of your work to make sure that everything is properly shown for judging. So if you have any questions on that, go to bhamaddies.com. Send us a question if you have any questions or don't know where to find links, and we're going to get that digital information to you. And wanted to also mention that the event, to go ahead and put on your calendar, the virtual gala is going to be Friday, February 26th. The Alice Stevens Center is a sponsor for this, and we are going to be producing the show at Alice Stevens Center. It'll be a full show that will be available for ticket buyers, and currently we are working on a discounted ticket for you for this virtual event. And since we are trying to make it extra special, we will have tickets that are going to be needed for this event, and which will include a virtual party pack for you to use for your virtual parties that you're having. And I think that will be a lot of fun. I know that, people are going to be making this really fun and special and doing something different this year, but it's an exciting event. You deserve it. There's been lots of great work out there this year. It's something that you can't put a hold on to that for no matter what happens in this world. So we really want to highlight that and give it the attention it deserves. So with that, I'd like to pass off to David Berry with United Ability. He is one of our board members here and past president. He's done a lot of work with AAF Birmingham, and we appreciate that. And he'll be introducing you to our speaker for the day. So with David, I will just pass that off to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks everybody for coming out. It's good to see all of you here, or some of you that have your cameras off. I'd also like to say thanks. We did send some invitations out to those that work specifically with organizations and groups in our community. And it's great to see Kelly with Down syndrome, Alabama, Michelle from the United Way of Central Alabama. I know Jana White and Karen do a lot of disability advocacy. Everett Fuller is the director of marketing for biotech Lemon Brace here. So again, thank you all for coming out and being a part of this. It's as past president, and even when I was president before the pandemic and everything else, Josh was one of the speakers that I wanted to be able to bring to Birmingham. It was harder to, and just financially harder to physically bring him to Birmingham, but the coronavirus, crisis has brought us all virtual and brought us closer together and made this possible. And Josh, I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule. Josh is a blind disability advocate. He's been in the advertising industry for 20 plus years. In his spare time, he's working on his PhD. He sits on several boards nationally. I know that he's on the Mosaic board for diversity with AAF National, and we can go on and on and on, but that would just cut into his time. And I know that one thing that the American Advertising Federation says that we are is we are the voice of advertising in the community. We've heard, the past year has been a lot about inclusion, and one of the voices that really needs to be included in all of the diversity is that of those with disabilities. And Birmingham has a very strong disability community. We have some organizations that are doing great work, and even in the World Games that are coming up in 2022, through the work with Lakeshore Foundation, there are going to be some sports that are that focus around disabilities. So we're very excited about that. So again, if everybody would just welcome Josh Loebner to AAF Birmingham. And then also thanks to those that are joining us. I know we have folks from Baton Rouge and some other cities throughout District 7. So we are thrilled to have you. If any questions pop into your mind during the presentation, just put them in the chat feature, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. And also, Sarah Franklin's joined us. She's with the Epilepsy Foundation, as I know, the executive director for a couple states. So welcome, Sarah. Josh, it's all you, bud.
David, man, that's awesome. Let me just confirm. Can everybody see my screen here? Is it coming in?
I see it.
Looks good. Right. Let me see if I can put it to slideshow. All right. Looking good still?
Looks
Hopefully.
good.
All right. And if you don't want to see the slides, you're welcome to just maybe enlarge my face to see the presentation. And if there's anything that is remiss or you need to revisit, I'm happy to send this as a PDF. David, thanks so much for that presentation. It's been exciting for me as a blind person to continue in advertising. And just for clarity, fully blind in my left eye. It's actually a glass eye, my right eye. I'm legally blind. Just a little bit more about my story. When I was born in 1973, I only weighed 2.5 pounds, which is kind of crazy. I was born 3 months premature. The doctor said to not name me. My parents said to heck with that. So they named me Joshua Bernard Zachary Loebner, and the longest name they could think. And I survived, but with some disabilities. And I do want to share that oftentimes disability is looked down upon or seen as second class or pitiful or from a charity perspective. And I'm proud to have a disability. I'm proud to say that I'm part of the disability minority group. Just one quick story about Birmingham. I did a focus group there. It's been almost 2 decades. It was for Barber's Dairy. And we were asking different people what they liked or didn't like to have with their milk. And this one young lady, different people in the focus group, some people said, well, I like my milk with cereal. Some people said, I like my milk with cookies. And this one lady, I'll never forget, she said, I like my milk with bourbon. So anyway, that's neither here nor there regarding disability, but it's just a connection to Birmingham that I'll never forget. I love Birmingham and the state of Alabama. I've spoken in Alabama on disability and diversity, equity, and inclusion in advertising in different places and communities, much more so than any other state. So this is super great to continue those conversations. As we just heard, AAF has changed their logo. They're super excited about it. And on my role with the Mosaic Council, we are looking to continue to kind of bring that into the fore. And one connective point is the unifying voice for advertising, as David had just mentioned. Unifying is powerful, and that's the great thing about advertising. While we all try to have brand tribes and differentiate, advertising does have the power to unify. Of course, that everybody is going to connect with on the Super Bowl coming up in just a few more days. But that's an opportunity from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. And that's something to be mindful of. Before I dive into disability, I do want to share that Black Lives Matter. And when it comes to Black lives that matter, agencies have had a reckoning regarding race and equity. And from a branding perspective, we've seen some of that change, whether it's Aunt Jemima changing its name, NASCAR saying no more Confederate flags, the Redskins changing their name, Cleveland Indians now looking to change their name, Cream of Wheat, household brand names, Mississippi changing its flag, the Dixie Chicks taking Dixie off of their name. And when it comes to disability, though, that's a consideration to think about. How does disability fit into it? And what I do want to share is that disability is a significant minority in the U.S., either independently or when you connect it from an intersectionality standpoint. Vast amounts of the population have disabilities, and in particular, here in the Southeast, there's more propensity for people to have disabilities than anywhere else in the U.S. The other thing to consider about disability, to an extent, versus other minority groups, is that anybody could have a disability at any time, whether we're born with it like me, or whether we age into it, or in some other capacity due to genes or otherwise. And so from an ad agency standpoint and from an advertising standpoint, if this audience is so huge and anybody could come into it, this isn't a small niche, but it's large. Here's the sticking point and the challenge, though. We don't see a lot of it in advertising. And because we don't see a lot of it, we don't think it's a large population. But we need to reframe that consideration when it comes to disability inclusion, either on screen as talent, people with disabilities in roles in advertisements or captured in a print ad or brochure or website or rich media, but also those people who are copywriters or strategists, that disability shouldn't exclude from advertising either being seen or being represented in the workforce. I love advertising. I love advertising so much that I teach it, that I married an art director, that I focus on it in my research, the majority of it tied to disability inclusion. But broadly, if we think about it, advertising is powerful. And that's both a welcoming consideration, but also, I think as we've seen in certain instances, if we look back in the history of advertising, it could be challenging. And so we need to consider how our role in advertising can help shape reality, the realities of those people who are our colleagues, either professionally, who we network with in the AAF, or how we see reality in the ads that we create and that are consumed by consumers. Well, disability has had challenges far too often. Disability, it's been said, doesn't belong in public, where people with disabilities were ostracized. They were segmented. They were put in basements. People with disabilities were put in back rooms. This slide shows a book cover, and it talks about the ugly laws. The ugly laws were put in place across cities in the US, where if somebody with a disability in the late 1800s or early 1900s walked out in the public, they could be arrested, they could be fined. And so this stigma for disability started to be materialized within communities. And people with disabilities were institutionalized. So many were siloed and segmented in a way that they weren't part of that reality that we just talked about. They were apart from it. They were seen as abnormal and not part of society. But now we're starting to hopefully see a reframing where people with disabilities are normal. I hope I'm as normal a guy as anybody else. I may be missing an eye and can't see very well, right? But that doesn't make me any lesser of a person. There is a big challenge, though. It's been said that disability doesn't belong in society. Today marks Holocaust Remembrance Day. And at one time, many years ago, there was an entire nation that felt like people with disability didn't belong. And while hopefully the majority of people remember the Holocaust and are familiar with it, many are not familiar with Action TK4, which was the Nazis' initial pathway towards annihilation of races and peoples, and disability was the first group that the Nazis felt like needed to be erased. And I say that now because to an extent, it's not part of some distant history. On this slide here, you see somebody protesting the recent COVID restrictions for lockdowns that we had earlier in this year. And they said, sacrifice the weak. And while that's one poster, I can guarantee that that's not just one individual that felt that way here in America. That's where advertising can, from a reality standpoint, be wholly negative or hopefully shaped towards a positive. I also do want to state, I think everybody, of course, who's listening in on this recognizes where Alabama has been and the commitments that Alabama broadly has from a DE&I perspective in very positive and significant ways, whether it's the memorials there or the organizations that are in place that are based in Alabama that at a national level champion diversity, equity, and inclusion. The consideration, though, is that a lot of those images, when it comes to Alabama, had to deal with protests that helped reframe diversity, equity, and inclusion from a minority standpoint when it comes to people of color and other marginalized groups. Well, oftentimes people with disability are seen as passive, are seen as not being able to have a voice when it comes to protest or changing perceptions. But people with disabilities have protested, and they still do. 1977, the largest and longest sit-in ever was by people with disabilities in San Francisco. So I just want to make that point, is that oftentimes, while minority history is celebrated in certain instances, disability history sometimes is not. Of course, this year it was with the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I do want to share, though, that it wasn't just an act that was 100% agreed to by all of the Congress people. This image here shows the Capitol Hill crawl, where people with disabilities literally, if they had a mobility disability, turned their wheelchair to the side and crawled up the steps to be seen by lobbyists and legislators to have that consideration to be able to get that legislator to vote for the act. And disability, to an extent, doesn't belong in advertising. Advertising is woefully remiss for representation of people with disabilities, wholeheartedly in the workforce, and most definitely within representation. This was an article I wrote early on in the COVID pandemic, in that brands were trying to somehow embrace the lockdowns, the isolations, and they would show people in their homes, and they tried their best to be able to represent from a minority standpoint and diversity and equity standpoint. But disability was nowhere to be seen. And still yet today, disability has had a very downturned trending when it comes to representation in 2020. And what I would argue is that disability, almost more than any other year, especially when it comes to COVID, needs to be represented because so many people with disabilities are immunocompromised and are one of the audiences who have had to fight to be represented in medical communications, and advertising needs to recognize that. It's not all bad though. Advertising is welcoming disability. And I don't want to share any specific examples other than these that I have here to showcase that many positives have happened. The recognition though and the opportunity for this conversation is that oftentimes these are major multinational conglomerates that have millions of dollars, that have internally amongst their employees affinity groups or employee resource groups specific to people with disabilities. And so disabled voices at these multi-million-dollar national conglomerates, of course, is much more heightened. But when it comes to mid-level agencies and advertisers in communities like Birmingham, Knoxville, Tennessee, where I am, and others that the AAF represents, disability oftentimes isn't part of the conversation. And from my perspective, it needs to be just as much as any of these organizations that are, on Madison Avenue or in major metropolitan areas. The one thing that I will say about disability and representation is that there's this creative pendulum when it comes to disability and inclusion. And you could say that these are the same when it comes to any minority group, but there's pity factor sometimes that's been seen in advertising. There's othering, infantilism, SuperCrip, and I'll talk about these all a little bit more in a second. There's pandering, there's inspiration porn, which I'll define for you. And then there's erasure, where people just kind of throw up their hands and they're like, hey, we don't have anybody that has a disability that works for us. I don't really talk to people with disabilities. They're a niche audience. We don't need to include them. And that really shouldn't be the conversation that's being had. There's also another consideration about virtue signaling, and virtue signaling means taking a thin veneer of representation from a corporate or brand standpoint. I'll give you an example. Pride Month, many brands change their social media icons to rainbow colored. And if that's the only thing that brand does for welcoming queer and gay pride, then they are virtue signaling. They are taking the thinnest veneer of welcoming of that minority, when potentially so much more could be done. For example, recognizing employees that are in that minority, or developing products that are specifically geared towards certain minorities. So, or ad campaigns that are a bit more entrenched and end-to-end representative of a company's deeper ongoing commitments. And the same is true for disability. In October, we had Disability Employment Awareness Month. And there are so many different instances throughout the year where disability could and should have a voice. Here's what I'll say about the current challenge is that so many people, whether it's presentations like this or research studies when it comes to disability inclusion, is that everybody's kind of appetite is whetted to see the commercials. They want to see those commercials that are successful, and they want to see the commercials that maybe aren't hitting the mark when it comes to disability inclusion. But I don't like to talk about that because oftentimes that doesn't provide any definitive action or a way for people to operationalize these conversations that happen. The gap that I would suggest is that in the advertising creation process, when it comes to developing a creative brief, does your agency have broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion questions that you ask in the creative brief? And is that brief referenced throughout the production? When it comes to the production itself, are you looking at talent that have disabilities or that broadly are minorities? Or do you have production companies that incorporate employees and staff that are of a minority or that have a disability? And then campaign creative, everybody kind of pats themselves on the back sometimes when, hey, we put somebody in a wheelchair in our ad amongst a group of others. But the challenge is that ad accessible to people with disabilities? For example, if it's a TV commercial or a website commercial, are you incorporating closed or open captioning? And for example, could there be audio descriptions or transcript, looking at alternative ways from a media consumption standpoint that people with disabilities might be able to really invite themselves to connect with the brand? And then ultimately, beyond the creative process, this is a fundamental breakdown when it comes to our industry, is the education component. Uh, every university, whether in Alabama or otherwise, has a disabled student services a department or student accessibility department where students with disabilities, such as myself, when I was a student or still am as a PhD, would connect. But that group and those students rarely, if ever, are reached out to by communications departments, by PR departments, by advertising and marketing and business departments to consider coming on board. My background was not always in advertising. I took a wrong way turn in forestry, a degree in forestry for my undergraduate degree, and as a blind person, that was not right. I didn't have a mentor. I still don't have a mentor. So it's looking at how the education can change to be able to ensure that we're welcoming more students with disabilities into advertising, but as well that professors, that students that are in programs currently can look at their lectures, their syllabi, their reading materials, their course materials to better incorporate broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion, but as well disability and accessibility. Students are graduating excited to be developers, programmers, social media strategists, account managers, and designers. And they're getting wonderful training at the universities, but they're very zero to no training. They don't get the training when it comes to accessibility and disability inclusion, or broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to share a few different words right now that to an extent either invite positives or some negatives when it comes to disability. This is kind of a disability 101 when it comes to language. And we all know the importance of language in advertising, and that language changes. I will say, just as a preface, that none of these words that I'm sharing that are positive are wholeheartedly ones that everybody needs to associate with. We as individuals can speak hopefully for ourselves and should be comfortable with what we feel like makes sense for kind of our place. But we can look at how language changes from the standpoint of other minorities, whether it's people of color, whether it's the LGBTQ community, and with disability as well. And so the word handicap is something that I hear people still using when it comes to handicap parking. Just as a clarifier, it's accessible parking and not handicap parking. Cripple is definitely not a word we want to use. Handicapable, I'm not a fan of kind of portmanteaus or matching together words to define who we are, or differently abled. And again, some of you might accept these, but from my perspective, as a community, these potentially present some challenge. Special needs, I'm not any more special than anybody else. And then invalid or invalid. We like disability. There's a campaign, a social media campaign called Say the Word. Again, I'm proud to say disability. Disability should be celebrated. It shouldn't be whispered in back rooms. There's a medical model versus a social model. Oftentimes we think of disability simply as a medical model, and yes, there's a component to that, but there's also a culture associated with disability, and I'm proud to be a part of that culture. We can think of any other minority as simply the medical model. Women, you are just a medical model. Men, you're just a medical model. White men, we could look at skin color, pigment. People of color, we can just look at a medical model, right? But we don't. For all other minority groups, we look primarily at the cultural model and social model of who those people are. And for disability, I would argue that should be that way as well. One-dimensional versus intersectional. People with disabilities are not props. Don't look at us simply as one-dimensional in your creative treatments, copywriting, or representation in an ad. There's an intersectionality to us. And that intersectionality can layer on both positively and negatively with regards to layering different minorities, such as, for example, a queer Black woman who is in a wheelchair. And there has been, to an extent, a consideration of whitewashing in representation of minorities, where disability has always been seen as, let's not layer on that minority. It's okay to layer it on because that is representative of reality. And please don't take anything that I'm saying right now as shaking my finger or wagging my finger at anything that the industry is doing wrong or that any individual in the industry is doing wrong. We're all on a different journey, either as people trying to accept others as professionals in the work that we do, as a networked group, whether in the AAF or broadly in the advertising industry. We're all at a different place when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion and welcoming disability. So don't take anything that I'm saying as saying that right now everyone is doing something wrong, but rather, how can we all just listen to this conversation right now and find out where we are in the journey and how we can keep moving forward positively to progress. So ableism versus equity. Ableism really is to an extent a perception of societally looking down at people with disabilities, looking at them as second class. Equity, though, is a consideration that hopefully I am on par with others in the same way, and that in the industry, people with disabilities can be copywriters, they can be strategists, they can be producers, and they can be talent on screen. Inspiration porn versus allyship. Inspiration porn is really a vacant inspiration where we hear sad music or we see somebody with a disability playing a piano in a social media posted video, and there are multiple thousands of likes on it and people saying that they're inspired. But that to an extent is a consideration where abled people are inspired, but they're inspired in a very weird, twisted way where to an extent they feel better about themselves because they don't have a disability. But oh, by the way, look at what that disabled person can do. We definitely don't want that. When it comes to those people who don't have a disability, we want allyship. We want arm in arm support and representation, just as any other minority would want. Infantilism versus adulting. Infantilism is looking down at people with disabilities, whether they're neurodiverse, whether it's an invisible disability, such as autism, whether it's someone with Down syndrome, that they are lesser than any other person. People in wheelchairs, oftentimes, and little people are seen as childlike, even when they're adults, even when they hold doctorate degrees or are very high up from a managerial perspective. We're adults, and people with disabilities have adult relationships and drink beer and get married and have adult relationships. And so those are things that when you're thinking from a creative standpoint, don't just look at that disabled person as being that individual that needs help. Actually put them in the protagonist spot in the commercial and let them help others. Let them show others some things that maybe they don't know. SuperCrip versus social normalization. The Paralympics are coming up, so brands are kind of scratching their heads. Hey, it's been 4 years. We need that Paralympian in our spot. And Paralympians are super cool. And I totally don't want to disparage or be negative towards Paralympians or the brand affiliations and connections that they have, because that's amazing. But for advertisers and brands, we don't just need to think about disability during the Super Bowl or during the Paralympics. And as well, we don't want to think simply of people with disabilities in that position of a vaunted athlete that does certain things in the athletic world. I'm not an athlete. The majority of people with disabilities are not athletes. The majority of people of color are not basketball players. But we can look back to tropes in advertising in the past that tried to represent people of color in one uniform way, and the negatives and mistakes made there as a pathway for what not to do when it comes to people with disabilities. We're normal, just like everybody else. Disability friendly versus disability facts. We don't want brands to just say, hey, we're disability friendly, because what does that mean? Especially when it comes to, for example, brands that might be a destination or a hotel or an attraction or a ride share. What are some disability facts that you can bring up? Is your physical space accessible? And what does that accessibility mean? Do you have an accessible bathroom if you're at a restaurant? And because when I'm there, I'm probably going to need to use the bathroom. So how can you be very factual? And so that could be interpreted to understanding advertising is supposed to be very emotive and making the ordinary extraordinary. You can't maybe bring up so many disability facts in a 30-second spot, but in your digital ecosystem, whether it's in your social media, whether it's on your website, whether it's in your app, these are definitely opportunities to be a bit bolder and more narrative driven and content driven when it comes to disability facts. This is pretty self-explanatory. I am not a second-class citizen, nor are my disability brothers and sisters. we're simply citizens. And that's what needs to be reframed. But from an industry as a whole, it's still to an extent woefully behind. So the hot topic in our industry, website accessibility. Everybody wants to check that box. My website is accessible. Accessibility is a human right, and everybody should have an accessible website or be on the path to making their website as accessible as they can. And there are various economical ways to start down that path. But what I will say is, if you only as a brand, advertiser, or agency celebrate website accessibility from a disability inclusion standpoint, there's a few things that need to be considered that you may be missing. A website is only one component of a larger campaign ecosystem. Social media has opportunities to be more accessible and more connective. Advertising campaigns definitely have opportunities to be both more accessible and more connective. Even developing the campaigns themselves have opportunities to be more inviting to people with disabilities. Research is, again, one of the considerations in our industry that there is very little data on people with disabilities. But if you as a brand, as an agency, are developing new research for 2020, definitely throw in some questions that can give you some more insight to people with disabilities when it comes to consumers. So I like to say that there's a bit of an alphabet soup right now when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've recently kind of changed to where D and I, or diversity and inclusion, is now the standard acronym is DEI, or DE and I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The challenge with both that acronym, and there are some others like JEDI, which stands for justice, equity, disability, or diversity and inclusion, I should say. The challenge with a lot of these is that they're not anchored to anything other than human resources. Oftentimes when people think of D&I or DE&I or DEI or JEDI, that people think, oh yeah, that's just for the HR people to worry about when it comes to hiring people or maybe getting interns, or some type of percentage that we need to have in our agency to be able to pitch state or government jobs to show diversity. But that's not the case. My goal is to reframe people's perspectives, and especially in the advertising industry, consider that alphabet soup into a word that we're all familiar with, and that's ideas. And ideas stands for inclusive, diverse, equitable, accessible successes. Every one of us wants either the brands that we work for or as an agency, the brands that we work with, to be successful. And that's where diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility need to be a part of. If you speak with, as an agency, for example, to a brand and ask them what their goals are, look to ways to be able to weave in equity, inclusion, and accessibility conversations. Don't just look at business successes as one kind of component that may not welcome that, but look to ways that it can. And that accessibility, as we mentioned about website accessibility, that's just one component of welcoming people with disabilities. Look to ways to be more inclusive. Look to ways to consider diverse opportunities, people of color who have disabilities. Look to be equitable. Along with serving on the Mosaic Council, I'm on Adweek's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And after reviewing some data and information, we all came to the conclusion that people with disabilities are the least represented at senior levels in the advertising industry. I'm proud to say that I'm a director. I've been in the industry for 20 years, but there are very few, if any, individuals with disabilities that are higher up, either in creative positions or otherwise. And so it's an opportunity to look to move people with disabilities up from an equitable standpoint. So just to leave you guys with this, so that we can start with some questions or get on with our day. Accessibility is being able to get into a building. Diversity is getting invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table, and belonging is having your voice heard at the table. That's really what we want in advertising. We want our voice to be heard, whether we're pitching creative, whether we're on the media team, sharing recommendations, whether we're the client, that we're being heard. And so people with disabilities want that same thing. Hopefully none of this seems too monumental to overcome, and hopefully we can answer some questions right now. So I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen and open the floor to questions or conversation.
That was awesome, Josh. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, just go ahead and type them into the into the chat box. I've got a couple that are already there. I will ask those. If you feel like typing, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. But again, we would love to hear from you. The first question that we have is what are ways, or are there ways to represent people with invisible disabilities in advertising?
I get that question basically at every AAF presentation that I share, and a lot at the council level. Invisible disabilities can be shared, and what I would suggest is that think about advertising as an ecosystem. We're not just talking about that 30-second TV commercial anymore, but there are ways to incorporate it into a 30-second commercial. But understand that when it comes to, for example, invisible disabilities, I have an invisible disability. I look like with glasses that I can totally see without my cane. If I don't have my cane with me, people think that I can see 20/20, but that's not true. For people who are neurodiverse, for example, that have autism or other neurodiversity, sometimes it can be challenging from a creative consideration to convey that. And so that's where copy, content, voiceover, the overall story arch can start to weave in those considerations when the visible portion can't tell the whole story. Also consider how that ecosystem can be unpacked. For example, if there's Autism Awareness Month, what is your social media team doing to be able to promote Autism Awareness Month? Or any other day or month that celebrates inclusion of those invisible disabilities, as well, behind the scenes footage to tell more of a story. When it comes to websites, of course, again, I mentioned broadly, just content that could be written about, but one consideration when it comes to neurodiversity are social stories. And social stories is a term, I can't tell you the etymology of it or the background of the definition, because whenever we hear social stories in the ad business, we think of social media. But social stories are places and spaces on websites that walk through experiences of places. I'll give you an example. I'm on the Dollywood. I love Dollywood. I'm on the Dollywood Disability Advisory Panel. And if you go to Dollywood's website, you'll see a social story section that walks through, for example, somebody who's neurodiverse, who has autism, what their experience will be like. And it's in very plain language text on the page with images that they can start to associate what their experience will be like. And also they have a wonderful calming room or quiet room at Dollywood. And so it's looking at end-to-end opportunities, again, staying with autism, and I just mentioned quiet rooms or calming rooms. If you have a physical brand you work with, a hotel, an event venue, a restaurant, are there considerations, an attraction, are there considerations to incorporate narratives within your efforts to bring up those invisible disabilities? So for example, Tennessee Aquarium is one of our clients, and there are opportunities that they have at the desk that they can hand out tactile bags with tactile elements in them to allow people who are neurodiverse or have other disabilities to be able to connect with tactile things such as beads or bracelets or fidget spinners to connect with that brand in a way that maybe a typical a person who's abled wouldn't need. And so it's not just looking at that singular 30-second spot, visually how to represent it, but if you're a graphic designer and you're asking that question, think about that broader brand map and how maybe if it can't be represented here as easily, what are some other ways that it can? Sorry for that long explanation.
No, that's awesome. The next question is, do you have any examples of any national or big regional campaigns that have implemented ideas well?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the initiatives that we've seen internationally, Channel 4 gave funding back in the previous Olympics to various brands based on the pitches that they came to. And Channel 4 is a network in the United Kingdom. And I shared a couple of screenshots of the Maltesers commercial. And the Maltesers commercial showed just a quick little synopsis of it. 3 women were having a conversation, and they were actually talking about their boyfriends. And I won't get into detail, but it was about adulting. And the young woman in a wheelchair was talking about it in a very casual and playful way, and she laughed. And the candy was still the brand hero in the commercial. Well, what that did, it showed equity from the standpoint that this person was not lesser than her peers and that she could guide the conversation. It was inclusive, and it showed a woman with a disability in a wheelchair, so intersectionality. And from an accessibility standpoint, the commercials had open captioning. Additionally, from a success metric, Maltesers was able to not only pin the metric of their sales to the commercial and the broader campaign that they had, but also their recognition as a company from a research standpoint as having more of an affinity from a corporate citizenship standpoint, connecting to broader diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and people with disabilities. So that's one internationally. And then here nationally, Microsoft is the leader. And I understand we're all Apple. I have an Apple computer, but I love Microsoft. And just to give a little bit of a deeper dive into that, they just had launched a Microsoft Surface commercial the other day, and or a few weeks ago. And there's a montage in the commercial that shows people using ASL to communicate. And it wasn't kind of the penultimate part of the commercial. It wasn't disability for disability's sake. It was just a family. And by the way, the son is deaf or hard of hearing, and he uses ASL, and the mom uses ASL. And hey, they've got a Surface laptop. Microsoft really, at their core, focuses on accessibility in all of their products, from PowerPoint to Word to Microsoft Teams. There isn't to their email platform, Outlook. They have accessibility at the center of all of their platforms and research and development that they're currently working on. And their brand managers know it. And McCann, their global firm, recognizes it as well. So it's not just a brand that does it well, but it's also the agency that recognizes the value of disability inclusion, or broadly DE&I. It's that partnership that can truly create amazing things. One last thing about Microsoft, we've seen recently in trade publications, including Adweek, where brands, advertisers, and agencies have started to share more of the minority representation amongst their employees. Microsoft was one of the first brands to be able to share the number of people with disabilities that work for them globally. And that percent, not only versus the other minorities in Microsoft, but also representation of that minority compared to the reality of that population in the real world. So Microsoft is saying they have like less than 6% of their employees have a disability, where globally 15% of the population does. So they recognize that gap, and their goal is to bridge it over the next several years.
Nice. Another one is, what is an agency's role in bringing, ideas to their clients who may not be thinking about that, who may not be thinking in that direction? They're looking for the creative campaign. They're looking for, for help, but, disability awareness and inclusion is not, wasn't in their initial thoughts.
Right. And David, hey, I work at that agency too, right? I've been in the industry 20 years, only on the agency side. And it's not a conversation that is often brought up at the fore by brands or even internally. And that's where, if the product or the brand isn't specifically focused on disability, it doesn't need to be the main part of the story, and it doesn't need to cost more. But what can you look at from a sustainable way to be able to start to seed that conversation? Hey, let's look at our creative briefs. Let's just start to incorporate questions about broadly DE&I, but also about disability. And if the advertiser, the client contact starts to ask questions or push back, just talk to them a little bit more. And what I would say is, for everybody on this call right now, David, you have brought so many champions, allies, and individuals that are in the Birmingham area that focus on disability inclusion, disability advocacy, that if an advertiser or an agency is scratching their head and doesn't know where to go, before this, they might have been able to say, why should we do this? But I think after this conversation, looking at who you've brought to the table, it should be something that definitely needs to be part of the conversation. And again, something that doesn't need to, oh my gosh, stop all the presses. We need to turn off all of our websites and focus on disability. We don't want that. And again, everybody's on a different journey. Let's all just kind of recognize where we are and talk through different ways that we could start to have that conversation and to start to try a little bit more when it comes to disability inclusion, not reinvent the wheel.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? There have been a couple. Okay, well, not directly for Josh, but we did record today's presentation, and we will make that available to everyone who attended. Someone asked if your presentation is available, and if so, you can email that to Jake or myself, and we can make sure that it gets out. Are there any other questions? Awesome, Lisa, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I'm a copywriter, so I took lots of notes. I think great information, and we really do appreciate you being with us today. And to everyone else out there, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hopefully seeing you at our ADDIE Award event, American Advertising Award Gala, in February. So, and again, get those entries in by midnight this Friday. If you have any questions, please let us know. If you're having any issues with finding information on how to do our digital entries, please send us a question on that. But thanks again for a great meeting, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. We'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming out, everybody.